We will now have a presentation from Rabbi Bob Carroll. Bob would have loved to be here, but he has a medical problem that prevented him from traveling. I can tell you from personal experience, because in November I was in Jerusalem. I went to one of the encounters that Bob will now talk about. And I can't tell you what a wonderful event it was. But I have to be careful not to steal Bob's thunder. So, Bob, are you ready to talk to us?
Yes, I am ready to talk, and I have no thunder. So go right ahead.
We can't hear you.
Okay, Richard, thank you so much.
It is muted.
Can you hear me?
No, I don't think it is. Can we? Sorry, just bear with us, Bob. The sound isn't on here.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Am I muted?
Good. We can hear you now. Thank you.
Great. Okay, Robert, thank you so much. It was an amazing pleasure to have you in Jerusalem. And I was just thinking just now that I should have gotten ready to share some of the pictures of the places that we went to, but maybe we will have another opportunity for that. So before I say anything, I just wanted to mention that I know that many of you in the room have known Yehuda Stolov, who's one of our founders, and Shlomo Alon for many, many years. And thus, not only do many of you have a longer history with IARF than I do, but some of you may have a longer history with the IEA than I do. So what I would like to do is try to not simply recreate some talks that I know Yehuda has given at conferences in the past, but I'd like to recap a little bit of that and tell some folks who aren't familiar with our work who we are and what we do, and then hopefully give a little bit of not a deeper perspective, not a broader one, but a different one, just as seen through my own eyes and my own experiences. As someone who got involved with the IEA a few years after it was founded. The organization was founded in 2001, and I was in fact in Jerusalem at the time. It was an extremely, extremely difficult time to be in Jerusalem for anyone. So I feel that I've shared some of the experiences that led to the founding of the organization, but I was not part of it for until a few years later. So just by way of a short introduction, we live in a time when fanaticism and hatred of the other threaten to take over all religions. And while these phenomena are as old as faith itself, their resurgence, and in some cases ascendancy, present us all with a huge responsibility. Clearly, the world has rarely been more in need of a coalition of faith groups which together reflect the simple perception that just as God is infinite, so God's manifestation occurs through an infinite number of forms and structures and faiths and cultures, all of which constitute essential dimensions of God's truth, all of which I should say reflect essential dimensions of God's truth, and all of which critically need each other. In a second, hopefully I'll be able to show you a very brief video, which you'll see me in the video, but you'll also see my very good Muslim friend from Hebron, Dr. Talib Al-Khariti, who's been the Jewish co-chair. He's been a member of IEA's board and the Jewish co-chair of one of our subgroups for many, many years. He frequently cites a wonderful surah in the Quran, which, and I expect many of you will have heard it. This surah states that Allah, God, could easily have chosen to create us all the same, but deliberately chose not to do so in order that we may come to know and learn from each other. And it is exactly this understanding that fanaticism fears, and that fear, in turn, drives the dehumanization and demonization to which we can and must be the antidote. Over and over again, anywhere in the world, but especially in the Holy Land, we see that people confuse extremism for authenticity, and so often the extreme voices within a faith and in each society win the day by being the loudest and pretending to be the most religiously serious and authentic, when in truth they are the least. This is what we need to stand against. And all this is probably nowhere more evident than in the Holy Land, but thankfully, at least 20,000 people, I think the real number is probably much higher, but at least 20,000 people know better and have learned better. So with that thought, let me introduce you to a group of believers, and not only believers, but people who have come together, who have used faith to develop a deeper vision and a better way. I'm sorry that, Luke, I should have checked this with you beforehand, but are you able to play now the brief video?
Yes.
So if you can do that now, that would be great.
We focus our work on the Holy Land, and here the conflict seems to be much more explicit and much more acute. And I mean, all these negative feelings and the fear and the mistrust, even hatred, they're all because of the image that we maintain of the other. And this image that we maintain of the other have very little to do with the reality. It is composed mostly of prejudices and negative stereotypes that we pick here and there, but they are not representative of the whole people. So we need a direct experience that will not tell us, but allow us to reveal the humanity of the other. And you get that through an interface encounter. In our approach, we put the emphasis on people talking to each other. So the typical setting is a circle of people, 10, 15, up to 20, talking to each other.
Your ex-wife, after the divorce, this was not...
What we try to do is say that, well, if religion has been part of the problem, then it's got to also be part of the solution.
Working on the relations between the communities is essential before you can implement any model and expect it to be sustainable. If we don't trust each other, if we don't like each other, if we were afraid of each other, sooner or later there will be violent conflict between us.
I believe on peace. I think so it will be. But but when? I don't know. Maybe soon, maybe after 1 year, 10 years, I don't know. I do this for my children, my kids, not for myself.
I would say the importance of the group is the experience in and of itself, and not some future goal that might happen. Also, peace isn't a state, it's a process of like more conflict, less conflict, and so forth. As I think Martin Buber said, all real meeting is healing. So when there's a real meeting, then the Spirit of God is well as among us. And I think we feel that there is a kind of a divine spirit in being genuine, in opening, and being connected with one another.
When we are talking or we are discussing, we can find similarities, and we know the good thing about the other.
I think this is just the beginning of people having conversations, and as also has been mentioned in the group, our children may realize that this is a way to function in this world and not to be isolated and dismissive of the others. So it's a small step, but I feel proud that I'm involved in it.
We try to build a community of people who don't see each other as enemies, and even though we may disagree strenuously, we've built a foundation upon which agreement can eventually be reached by dint of the fact that we're friends and there's trust. You know, it all comes down to trust.
Our aim is, one, to bring as many as we can of people from different confessions, religions, whoever, to sit together in a respectful and peaceful atmosphere to discuss whatever they would like to tackle of any subject in a peaceful way and a respectful way.
And once you get the chance to meet a group, even a small group of 5 or 10 people from the other community, and you have a real conversation with them, this experience changes your the way you relate to the other.
Luke, thank you. I wanted to use this film as kind of a springboard for discussing how we do what we do, and we'll get to that in a second. But since I know that some of you have heard a version of this talk before, what I would want to do instead is just, firstly, I wanted to mention that the gentleman in the red hoodie that you saw in the video was Ibrahim, who I know many of you met in person at the last conference. The other gentleman who spoke, Talib, who he mentioned an ex-wife, and it was my ex-wife that he was referring to at the time. Talib is a personal hero of mine. I was introduced to him by Yehuda, and this is something you won't get from reading our data sheets or the videos or the activity reports. So I wanted to tell you the story in person. Not the only one that I have. Talib has been very, very active with us from the beginning. He runs an organization called the Palestine-Israel Peace Society, which is based in villages near Hebron, and which has about 300 members. And for the first 2 or 3 or 4 years of the existence of the group called the Circle of Light and Hope, which is one of our encounter groups, we met at a hotel known as the Everest Hotel, which is a Christian Palestinian-run hotel, which happened to be between Jewish Har Gilo, the Jewish town of Har Gilo, and Beit Jala, which is at the time was largely a Christian suburb of Bethlehem. It's less Christian now than it was 20 years ago, but at the time. So the hotel is owned by Christian Palestinians who had always been super supportive of interfaith work. And it become, I think it still is to some degree, one of the go-to places for interfaith meetings in the Jerusalem area, because it's very easy for Jerusalemites to get to. It's literally just a few minutes from South Jerusalem. And if one is Palestinian, one does not need to pass through a checkpoint to get to it. So it works for everyone. So we had 2 or 3 years worth of meetings in that spot. And one day, and usually the way we work is Talib came with a carload or two of people from the Hebron area, and I would come with a carload or two of people from the Jerusalem area, Jews, Christians, whoever was physically in Jerusalem. So one day we arrive, and we get out of the car, and we find that Talib and all of his people are sort of milling around in the parking lot. And I instantly knew that something was wrong. because there's no reason why they would have been milling around in the parking lot. They would generally have already been inside the restaurant, ordering the food, setting up the chairs, whatever. So I knew something was wrong. And I got out and I went up to Talib, and the owner of the hotel, who I know pretty well, came up to me and told me that the reason that nobody had gone in yet was that a few individuals who claimed to represent Fatah, the element within the Palestinian Liberation Organization, had approached him and told him that they were not at that time guaranteeing the safety of anyone who met with Israelis or Jews in the hotel any further. And so Talib and his folks weren't quite sure what to do. There was one obvious option, which was another hotel a couple blocks away. I kind of shot that down because it seemed to me that the same thing could just as quickly happen at that hotel. But even more so, I had been to that hotel, and I think that the Jews in our group, the Jerusalemite Jews, did not feel physically safe in that other hotel. So I turned to Talib and I said, for lack of a better metaphor, sometimes you need to live to fight another day. And we decided that we would find a new place to meet, that we would reschedule the meeting for hopefully within the next few days, but we would all go home. So we all did that. We all went home. And I got an email from Talib later that night, which he asked me to send around to everyone in the group, basically saying, he was very, very forceful, and he said he wants everyone to know that everyone in the group will not let this evil keep them from meeting with us, and that we will continue to do so. And he is a person who has consistently shown tremendous, tremendous courage. And that's something that I think the group had built up painstakingly, meeting by meeting, step by step, over the course of a few years. I have visited him in his home, and one of the things that Jews sometimes ask me is, do I feel safe going to his village? The answer is definitely not, because it's in a spot where Israelis are allowed to go, but only by about 50 meters. And I certainly feel very nervous going. I don't feel nervous being at his house, but I feel nervous being in that location generally. So the next question they asked me is, do I trust that Talib would protect me if anybody came to hassle me in his town, in his house? And I said, I absolutely trust that about 1,000,000%, and I am willing to trust my life to him. And this is the kind of relationship that we have built up. As many of you may have heard from Yehuda's talk previously, the Interfaith Encounter Association began in 2001 at the height of the Second Intifada by a group of longtime activists who felt that since religion was part of the problem, it can and must be part of the solution. And the first event was held near Nablus, and for Israeli Jews to go to anywhere near Nablus at that time was a very risky maneuver. It was a time when literally people were being blown up in the streets, both in Jerusalem and in the Nablus area. And the encounter started very, very tentatively, with people sitting on opposite sides of the room, kind of only speaking to each other, fearfully and politely, but nothing more. By the time the encounter ended, by the time the weekend ended, it ended with exchange of phone numbers, friendships that have continued to this day, and some of the people from that initial beginning have been active with us all along. And that initial meeting grew to what is today a core program, which has reached 120 encounter groups. I had to check that number because every time I check that number, it's gotten bigger than when I last checked it. So 120 encounter groups, not all of which are active. Some drift in and drift out, but we have about 40 to 50, I believe, at this time that are active, with about 8,000 ongoing participants. And to my surprise, in the course of the last year, even with pandemic issues and political issues, we have had over 400 encounters, which adds up to meaning that every day, almost certainly there is an encounter we're running every day, and many days have more than one encounter in different places per day, from all over Israel and the Palestinian territories, from Eilat to the Galilee, to many, many locations in the West Bank, in Palestinian areas. We have about probably 7 or 8 groups now, which include settlers and Palestinians, which is very, very unusual. We have groups for healthcare professionals in the healthcare delivery system, which work on cultural competency. We have groups of midwives. We have many, many groups of youth. We have a longer video, which I invite you to view on our website, about encounters with schools in the neighboring towns of Carmiel, which is an Israeli Jewish town, and Majd el-Krum, which is an Arab town. We have a number of groups with Jewish yeshiva students from the Hebron area, and also Palestinian students from that area. We have put together quite a few groups for clergy, and including a sheikhs and rabbis group in the Hebron area. And in more recent years, we've joined with other organizations in a program called Praying Together, where we each pray our own liturgy, but alongside each other, and we witness and honor the prayer of each group that is physically with us. This past year, we won the Israel's Presidential Award for volunteerism for our grassroots organizing, which was a tremendous honor for us and is opening many, many more doors in terms of diplomatically and funding and other organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So I've only touched on the barest amount of the work that's happening. What I'll do now is if I can figure out how to do this, I'll share my screen, and so you can at least look while I'm talking about some of the other host has disabled participant screen sharing. Okay, I won't share my screen. Lucas, you may have copies of the 2022 information sheet to give out. If you don't have them, I would encourage everyone to take a look at interfaith/encounter.org, where all this material is very, very available.
So I have made you a co-host so you can share your screen now.
Okay, let me give it a shot right now. Hold on. Share screen. Okay, great. Now I just have to, this was what I wanted to go to. I don't know if I'm doing this right, but let me call up the, this is a different document that I will refer to in a second. But all right, let me show you a few things, because seeing is better than hearing, right? This is a photo of the last meeting we had just a few days ago in New Jersey. Largely Jews and Muslims, but includes a few Christians also. This is one of our meetings at the Tantur Institute in South Jerusalem. This is one of the earlier meetings of the Praying Together group, which carries with it many, many wonderful stories, because sometimes we feel we're disturbing people in whatever surroundings we're in, but inevitably people see us and say, wow, look at this is great, and they join us. We were once on the roof of a building and we got stuck in a terrible rainstorm. So we quick ran into the restaurant in the building, and I thought, oh my God, we're going to make all these poor people who are just trying to eat dinner crazy. We're going to disturb them in the restaurant. And the people joined us in our prayers in the middle of their own dinner, which I thought was really wonderful. These are a few pictures of our joint iftar event. I believe these are from this year. Just flip through these very quickly. And just scrolling up. Okay, this is what I wanted you to see. This is our 2022 data sheet. I won't take the time to go through all of it, but you can see that this list is a list of our groups which are active at this time. Which ones do I want to just point out to you? You can see that geographically, they're all over, however we call it, Israel and the West Bank, Israel and the Palestinian territories. Sadly, We no longer have anything happening in Gaza. We had recently been approached by some Gazans about restarting one of the Gaza groups, but we decided that there was no way for us to do that in which it could keep the Gazan participants safe. So at this time, we think that the better part of discretion is to respect their safety and hope for better days when we can restart those connections. One of the things that we're doing, this group called Beit Midrash, is a study program in which we study religious texts which impact the relationship between Jews and Christians and Muslims. It's also been one of our very, very successful programs. We have a group of religious leaders that meets at the Tower of David, a Jewish Christian group studying the Gospel of Luke. We had gone through the Gospel of Matthew, and now we're on to the Gospel of Luke. I have been participating in that when I'm physically around, which hasn't been as many times lately as I would like, but I hope to return to participating in that one. The Circle of Light and Hope is the group I just described to you, where we met at the Everest Hotel, and you can see some of the rest just to give you a very general idea. I think it's important that I spend a few minutes talking about the methodology that Yehuda and the early founders have developed, because this is how we have become what we've become. And I think that the main thing that our experience has taught us is that if you put people in a room who do not know each other or who have not built up a level of trust between them, then disagreements, whether they're theological or political, tend to escalate, and people begin to feel defensive about their own identities and don't open up to each other. That's, the kind of thing where people sort of take a corner, right? Whether it's a metaphorical corner or a real corner, but in one way or the other, they say, I'm going to defend my thing, I'm going to defend the fact that I'm right. I'm going to, engage in a little bit of polemicizing for my side, and that's okay, but it also doesn't lead to anywhere better. So what we do is we use religion and religious ideas as our springboard for conversation. This has a few benefits. Invariably, it allows people, even if they're not religious people, even if they don't consider themselves to be religious, it allows people to find that they have much more common ground than they had initially expected. And once that happens, differences can be seen as less threatening. We do not exclude political conversation, but we do hold it in abeyance initially. And my experience has been that a sign that the group is ready to talk about divisive political issues is when members feel comfortable enough to be self-critical or critical of their own in-group. Before that point is reached, I usually encourage people to hold off on criticizing what they see as being characteristics of the other groups, because they're generally wrong. And it's been my experience that if you develop an atmosphere where people feel comfortable and safe, then they will start criticizing each other. They will start criticizing their own groups or people on their own side, and they're very, very capable of understanding that we all make mistakes, that we're all not perfect, that we all misinterpret our own faith sometimes, and that's an important thing to come out. Some of the topics that we have done, again, I can give you a whole list of topics, but some of the topics that we've done have been sort of tangentially political. One that I can think of is the holiness of place, sacred spaces. And the office sent me a little note when we decided to do that topic, saying, be a little careful with this topic. We're a little concerned that it might not go well. And I responded, listen, we've been together for 15 years. I'm entirely comfortable with this. I think it's going to be fine. And it really, really was. We had no problems with it. So not an explicitly political topic in the sense of what should governments do to fix the conflict, but something which impinged on the conflict very, very closely. And the group is able to handle these things very, very successfully at this point because we've built that kind of trust. Another weird story that happened, weird but instructive, was we had a retreat, And one of the topics that we were discussing at the retreat was, this one seems to be an easy topic, but it's really not. And the topic was the age of the earth. Why do I say it was really not so easy? Because if someone takes the biblical text literally, which is really not a Jewish thing, by the way, but some do. If you take the text literally, then you have this belief that evolution didn't happen and the earth is, slightly less than 6,000 years old, et cetera, et cetera. So we were discussing that topic with no problems whatsoever when a sheikh who often attended, his name is Yusuf, and I knew him pretty well as someone who was always very, very intellectually involved, very, very brilliant, capable of asking the occasional sharp question, direct, not inappropriate, but direct. So Yusuf turned to me in the middle of discussing how old the earth is and asked me what the Jews in the group believe about the Baruch Goldstein massacre. As you may know, there was a terrible massacre. This was many years ago now, which took place of Muslims at prayer in the cave where Abraham and Sarah are buried, where the patriarchs of both our faiths are buried in Hebron. So in the middle of totally other things, right, he asked me, what do the Jews think about that? Do we think that the guy who did this was a martyr or a murderer? And I'll tell you what I answered him. The answer was easy, but the reason I bring up the story is to tell you that with a different group, if we hadn't known each other, right, if we had all walked into the meeting 10 minutes before and someone had put that question on the table, people would have been a little taken aback. They would have been a little defensive. They might have thought, whoa, I don't know if it's a good idea to go there, right? But in this group, nobody was offended by it. And I simply said, it's rare that I would speak for the other Jews in the group, but this time I will. And because I'm confident that I do speak for all of them in saying that we all believe him to have been a horrible murderer, and what he did was 100% inexcusable, whatever his motivations were. And then we continued to talking about the age of the earth. So as part of that encounter, we developed a few years ago a list of suggested guidelines for fruitful interfaith conversation. And we developed these ideas out of the observation that deep face-to-face encounter can be profoundly transformative because it shows people that their a priori ideas about the other are so often mistaken. This is something that Yehuda talks about a great deal. So I wanted to share with you very, very quickly some of these guidelines and just talk a little bit about how they work and how they help us, and how perhaps they can help the IRF as well. So as I said before, we use religion as our main tool of conflict resolution. This does not mean that one has to be religious or a believer to take part, but religion permeates culture in the Holy Land, even among those who call themselves secular, in very deep ways. So for all of us, religious texts and religious ideas allow us to address core issues of identity and meaning and allow us to find shared values. When discussing how one relates to religion and religious ideas, or even how religion and religious ideas bother you sometimes, even that's just as good. And that's also a topic we've done. When having that conversation, the conversation becomes much more intimate and existential and personal and deep, and people open up. And once people feel that they've been opened up to, any defensiveness that remains dissipates and dissolves and really helps the conversation to go forward. We have done as topics, by the way, there was a meeting when we asked people to come up with a list of all the things about their religion that really irk them. And it was fascinating because we found that different members of different faiths may critique their faith and their group in different ways, but we all do it. And I think that we all found it cathartic to do it. And we also felt that doing so was able to bring us together, and even bring us together and even strengthen our own identities as Jews, Muslims, Christians, whoever else was there. So the idea of discovering shared values sounds like, it sounds super simple and self-evident and pedestrian, but in reality, it can be a tremendous revelation. Most religious people in the Holy Land, I should speak only for the ones that I know best, which are the Jews. Many, probably most Jews, are raised to think that religion is a zero-sum game and that the correctness of our own faith is predicated on the others being wrong, that we don't have anything in common, that, that it's black and white. That's ridiculous, of course, but it's something that one can also dissipate by face-to-face encounter. And I would add that it's something that non-religious people often see as an essential characteristic of how religious people think. And they're not wrong, but it also depends on which religious people one is talking to. The second principle is, I already said this one, we keep politics out, at least initially, and we don't have official topics that are political topics, because we're not the people who are going to be drawing up the political agreement to end the conflict. But everyone is free to ask any question as long as they do so respectfully, and occasionally someone does come up with a zinger question, which is fine. Number 3, everyone is an individual, and they represent only themselves, not a, quote, side or people or even a religion. This gives everyone the freedom to say something that, may not have the backing of the authority figures in their faith or their sacred texts. It gives people license to simply be themselves and to be people. Number 4, this is a huge one. There's about 11 of these altogether, so it won't take us too long. Number 4, never assume you know someone else's views. Always ask them. Don't make statements in which you act as if you already know what they think because of their religion or nationality or anything else. Number 5, don't globalize. There's really no such thing as the Jews or the Muslims or the Christians. Don't put people in a box. Be ready to hear that we're all different and we may not fit the mold. To some degree, all of us, and by which I mean all of us here, are people who don't fit in the molds because we step a little bit outside of our comfort circle. So everyone can do that. Almost everyone can do that. And it's important I think, to encourage that in the way that we run the meetings. Number 6, also an obvious one, no ad hominems. Ad hominem is Latin, and what it means is something which refers to a person in their essence rather than the idea that he or she has expressed, or which attempts to infer the validity or the lack of an argument, or the lack of validity of an argument from some personal characteristic of an individual. For example, if you look at someone and say, well, you would say that because you've been propagandized into believing that people like us aren't even human anyway. That's an ad hominem statement. So we try to separate ideas from individuals and criticize only the ideas, not the individuals as such. Number 7, we speak for ourselves rather than with absolutes or labels. Use I statements such as, I believe you are wrong because, or I believe you are mistaken because, is much better than you are wrong, you are mistaken, right? Because it takes judgment out of it. Number 8, active listening. Reflect back what you think is being said to the speaker so he or she can verify that you have correctly understood what was meant. Part of the problem with religious dialogue is that concepts are very subtle and complicated and can easily be distorted and twisted or treated very selectively, especially in the media and social media and in popular discourse. So what we hear others say in dialogue is often conditioned by what we think we already know, and what we think we already know is often, at the very least, only partially true. When a speaker says something, when an individual says something that differs from what you think about how he understands a concept, believe him. Don't assume he isn't telling you the truth about what he thinks because you know better about his religious concept than he does, right? We all have a hierarchy of values. We all have ways in which we reconcile apparently conflicting sacred texts. So one of the things that can happen in dialogue to lead it astray is when someone selectively takes one verse of scripture or religious law and assumes it represents all that the other person believes on that subject. I had a faculty advisor in my doctorate, Professor Elliot Wolfson, who used to have a strange motto, but eventually I figured out what he meant by it. He used to say, texts, T-E-X-T-S, do not have mouths, meaning a particular religious teaching or verse is not abstract. It doesn't exist only on its own. It matters the way it is interpreted and understood by real people within real religious communities. And that's critically important to know. As an example, hopefully not inflammatory example, one can't learn what a Jew thinks about Hindus from reading biblical verses, because there's a whole hierarchy of values, there's a whole tradition of texts, there's a whole tradition of interpretation, all of which has to be brought to bear. The same would be true. You can't learn what a religious Muslim thinks about Jews, by pointing to one line from the Quran. You can't learn what a Christian thinks about Jews or what a Jew thinks about Christians. You need to know the totality of the tradition, how it's understood both by the group and the individual, and you need to know the chain of interpretation. There's a tendency in dialogue to sort of seize on something and say, oh, look, but you believe this, it says so right here. And that's almost always much more wrong than right. Okay, so next, moving on, we're almost done. We also do not hide who we are. On the contrary, we expect and encourage everyone to feel comfortable and welcomed in their identities. When I go into a meeting, I do it as who and what I am. I am an Orthodox rabbi. I am an Israeli Zionist Jew. I am all those things. A flip side of this, and it applies to anyone else in the dialogue, of course, is that only you define your own identity. One of the misunderstandings that happens sometimes, again, just to throw one out, because because I've had it happen to me, is one sometimes hears Christians, Muslims, anyone take the position that Jews are a faith and not a people. And once you're defined as a faith but not a people, the next question is, so what do you need a country for? You're not a nation, you're a religion. My answer is, since the very, very first moment of the creation of Judaism in the Bible, if you look at it, Jews are a people, Jews are a nation. This has been so from the beginning. God did not found merely a religion in the Bible. He founded a nation whose purpose it was to exist through history. But that's a textual answer. The personal answer is, who gave you the right to define me? We all have rights to define each other. You as a Muslim define what you are. I as a Jew define what I am. And I think that we each have a right to insist that be the case when we enter into dialogue with others. Doesn't matter if we agree with it. Doesn't matter if we understand it. Each one of us has a right to define our identity. And the last principle is also obvious. We don't seek to make anyone into something other than what they are, meaning no proselytizing. Sometimes people speak about why they feel particular teachings of their faith are so meaningful and holy, and that's perfectly fine, but proselytizing is not allowed. This has perhaps been a limiting factor in having us successfully reach out to some of the evangelical Christian communities. I don't know how much they would have joined us otherwise, but it is something that's very, very important to us. And it was also not at all a non-issue on the ground in the Holy Land. Proselytizing is a thing that very much happens. Lucas or whoever's running the show, do we have a few more minutes? I think I can see you walking up to the podium. Robert, if whoever's speaking, I can't hear you.
Hello, Bob. Can you hear me now?
We seem to have a sound problem.
You should be able to hear us.
Now it's better. Okay, you came back.
Okay. Bob, yes, we have about 10 minutes.
Okay, fine. So let me just finish up with two brief observations, and then hopefully you will have some questions and vigorous rebuttals or anything else. Little discretion. Many people argue that if you scratch the surface of most religious conflicts, you will find a very secular contest over money and power. This is not wrong. It's a very common thing. But there is a harder reality that we need to acknowledge. And I've always believed that religion can itself be a dangerous and destructive force, and it is wrong to ignore that. There's a Jewish leader, a modern Jewish leader who was tremendously influential, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who wrote in one of his essays, he discusses the incident in the Bible, in the book of Samuel, where the Ark of the Covenant is captured by Philistines. And he says, so what happens to it? They don't just run off with it and then they use the stolen Ark of the Covenant. What happens in the biblical story is there's a plague and it kills many of them, meaning it kills many of the Philistines who stole it. And Rabbi Soloveitchik uses this example to show that when religion is co-opted for ulterior motives, it doesn't just become neutral, but it can become an evil and destructive force. This is an acknowledgement that the more powerful a thing is, the more good it can potentially do, and the greater risks it carries. And I think that this is something that we all intuitively understand. And if one lives in the Holy Land, or probably in almost any conflict zone on earth, this is something that one sees on a daily basis. Some of our greatest leaders have spoken very eloquently of the dangers of nationalism, and one of the troubles that we also see is that when religion is recruited to support a position in the conflict, even if the struggle was originally about land or nationalism or whatever else, it has the effect of making any compromise impossible, even when that compromise is justified by self-interest. Because if I'm certain that my position is supported by God, then to show flexibility is to deny my faith. So it becomes a zero-sum game. That's very, very dangerous. By the way, I would refer also back to a position to what Dr. Young had said yesterday about, I don't remember his exact words, but the idea, and I don't know if he's in the room now, but the idea was that we can't shy from being political. I have always been among those in the clergy in my faith who took exactly that position, that if we don't have the guts to take a political position, then we really neuter the moral teaching of our faith and we give up our claim to be representing a deeper morality. I think that's absolutely true. But we need to also recognize that there's a great deal of purely political positions. There's a great deal of religious positions which have become politicized and therefore encased in concrete. And this is something that we also need to be aware of and find some way to address within our religious communities effectively. I think, one might assume that I think that this mostly happens in the extremist, conservative right-wing side. I think that that's true. It does mostly happen in that direction, but it is not unheard of anywhere. And I think it's a risk. I think we have to be very careful of it. Last thing, and then I'll stop. We often leverage the idea of the Abrahamic family as a tool in our peace-building efforts. I understand this doesn't speak to everybody in the room, but maybe there are analogs to it among Eastern faiths. So the beauty of using the idea of the Abrahamic family is that each group is able to retain its own identity and even, forgive me for saying it, its own sense of spiritual superiority while still recognizing the ethical and family bonds that we have with each other. The deepest among our participants are very aware that, like any loving parent, like Abraham with his own children, God wants us to love each other with genuine brotherly love. And they know that when this element is absent, our protestations about how much we love God ring very, very false. In this sense, religious identity and even the boundaries that it creates can be an ally of, or at least not work against, broader commitments to the dignity and rights of the other. Being more specific, in the biblical tale of Abraham and Sarah driving out Hagar, who of course becomes the mother of Ishmael, the Arab nation, one sees the tragic tale of preferring one son over the other, and it's easy to see that we're still fighting that battle 3,000 years later. I mean, we literally are still killing each other over that scene in the Bible 3,000 years later. But there's so much more to it if you look at it closely. If you read into it, if you drill down, God sends an angel to Hagar and says that God has heard her affliction. We are taught that God is merciful and compassionate to her in her suffering. So our tradition, I think all of our traditions, point out flaws in our heroes. And in the Jewish tradition, Abraham is implicitly criticized for not loving Ishmael, for not honoring the extended family ties that Ishmael's descendants and Isaac's descendants still very much share. So we, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, Jews and Christians are heirs to the version of the tale in which God chose Isaac and not Ishmael to carry on Abraham's faith and family. But the text is very subtle, and if we read all of it, and if we read it honestly, it scolds us for what we have all become. And this circles us around to the issue of trust. What we try to do is build the human infrastructure for peace, which we see as being a necessary precondition for political efforts to ever take hold. I need hardly tell you, I'm just going to wrap up quickly here because I do want to take some questions, but I need hardly tell you that there have been more top-down political efforts to bring peace in the Holy Land than any of us can even count. And so far, none have worked. And they haven't worked for a number of reasons, but part of the reason is that we are two peoples who are not ready to live in peace with each other, who do not trust each other. And many of these attempts, such as the Oslo Accords, really decided that they said, well, we have these blocking groups, in each society who are usually, more often than not, the ones associated with traditional religions. And they're not on board with this peace stuff because I think that God tells them that they can't give up 1 centimeter of their land or allow the other one to have any rights. So we don't have a way to fix this. So what we're going to do is just sort of pretend they don't exist and bypass them, like what we call in football, American football anyway, an end run. We're just going to get together the people that buy into the peace agreement and figure out what to do with the rest later. I'm being a little bit crude in my description, but essentially that's what the Oslo process was. It failed resoundingly. And so our position is that religious people can be brought on board as enthusiastic elements in the peace process. We don't get everybody, right? If you're a person who believes that the other has no rights, is not fully human, doesn't have a right to even live, okay, so, once in a while we convert one of those, but in general, they're not going to be coming into our meetings and saying, hi, I'd like to meet the other as an equal. But those people are very, very few in number. And we do get across the political spectrum pretty much everybody else. And that has been a tremendous, tremendous inspiration. There's an old proverb that says, if your vision is for a year, plant wheat. If your vision is for 10 years, plant trees. If your vision is for a lifetime, plant people. Sometimes in the Holy Land, it feels very hard to not lose hope. I've lost hope more times than I can count. In the short term, if I predicted that we were all in for a rough ride, I would be unlikely to be proven wrong. But even with all that, one person at a time, one encounter at a time, we are building a real grassroots movement of people who refuse to be enemies and who see each other as true friends. That never fails to inspire me, and I see so much in IARF that dovetails so well with this, and I really just want to invite you all to take a look at our website and to visit us in person whenever you can, and to be part of what we are doing. And I hope some of you have a few questions. Robert, I'm turning up my volume a bit. Okay. Robert, I think you're still muted. Or Luke is still muted.
Can you hear me now, Bob?
Yes. Now I've got you.
So sadly, I think we've run out of time. And very interesting is the story that you told us, as I knew it would be, of course. So my question is really a request. Can you share with us, and I'm talking about so that we can literally have it on our website and give it to everybody to take home, those 11 points of that you were making?
Yes. So I believe I found that file on my hard drive. I believe that was the version of it that I wrote up, which became part of our guidelines that we give out to our coordinators. So that version might be a little different, but I can send you the file. Absolutely. I left a few things out because I was trying to save time, but I'm happy to send you the file.
Well, I'm sure for anybody who wants to think about reconciliation and putting reconciliation in practice, your experience and the thought that you put into those points will be extremely valuable. And I would hope that everybody would take them home with him. Not just the people here in the room, by the way, but anybody who's listening online. So thank you very much, Bob. It's great to see you again. Sorry you couldn't be with us.
So am I. I would believe me. I would have. I feel everyone. The reason I am not there in person is due to a little medical problem which kept me away this time. But I do hope to meet you all and as soon as possible.
So thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Well, we have a break for quarter an hour. Can everybody please be back at 3:30?